This episode of The History Guy is brought to you by Incogni. It was not uncommon for kings and royals and men of title to die in combat in the Middle Ages when they were expected to participate personally in battles. And yet, despite all the risks of medieval combat and the expectations of nobility, many at the highest levels of aristocracy died in, well, less noble ways, from mundane accidents or even in embarrassing situations. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, for example, on his way to the Third Crusade, died not in battle, but drowned in a river, by some accounts while taking a bath. And there were many more nobles who died in, well, lesser circumstances than that. But despite those ignoble deaths, their deaths had lasting historical impact, and they deserve to be remembered. I've talked to you about Incogni several times now because in today's world, you just need Incogni. I got an email from my bank just the beginning of this week telling me to be vigilant looking out for scams because there have been numerous data breaches in numerous industries in the last month. Data pirates are relentless. Every time you click to buy or sign up for anything, there's a risk that they'll abscond with data like your name, address, phone number, even your social security number. And it isn't just a risk of getting more annoying spam. You can get scam phone calls, text, emails, and strangers can even get your home address, putting your credit, your finances, and even your family's security at risk. You need a data removal service that is as relentless as the data pirates. You need Incogni. Incogni seeks out these shadowy organizations that are collecting and selling your data, and they enforce your rights to have them remove the data that they have on you. And you can try to do that yourself, but it could take you hundreds of hours. You might not find them all. You might not know how to deal with their objections to get them to actually protect your rights and take off your data. Incogni is an essential tool in the data age. I've been signed up with Incogni for a year now, and they continue to look out for me. This month, my handy dashboard showed that they'd sent more than 50 new removal requests, and my data has been removed from hundreds of sites, saving me a whopping 190 hours if I had tried to do it all myself. So do yourself a favor and use the code TheHistoryGuy at incogni.com/TheHistoryGuy to get an exclusive offer of 60% off an annual Incogni plan. That's incogni.com/TheHistoryGuy and use the code TheHistoryGuy or use the link in the description. Take your data off the market. Historians consider the years of about 500 to 1500 to be the Middle Ages in Europe, roughly from the fall of the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire to the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, although various dates and events are used as start and end dates. It was an era of many fragmented kingdoms, duchies, counties, and other lay powers that changed significantly as various powers and kingdoms battled for supremacy. It was also an era of poor medicinal knowledge, leading to some notable deaths. In the 9th century, Norse Viking raiders began arriving in what is now modern Scotland. Norse and other Scandinavians heavily colonized the islands on Scotland's periphery, such as Shetland, Orkney, and the Hebrides. The islands became bases for raiding against the coast of Scotland and elsewhere, including Norway, after it was united in a single kingdom under King Harold Fairhair. Many of the records for the Norse period in this region come from the often only semi-historical Norse sagas, which modern scholars believe should be treated cautiously as historical sources. According to the Orkney-Inga saga, King Harold annexed the Northern Isles by force, and among his warriors was Ragnvald Eysteinsson, whose son Ivar was killed in the annexation. And as compensation, Harold made Ragnvald Jarl, or Earl of Orkney. Ragnvald then passed the title to his brother Sigurd. The Historia Norwegiae corroborates the account of Ragnvald and his family conquering the islands, but adds no details. Sigurd expanded his lands into the Scottish mainland, battling the locals and conquering land in modern Caithness and Sutherland. It was these conquests that earned him the epithet the Mighty. Near the end of his reign, around 892, Sigurd challenged a local ruler, Maelbricht the Buck-toothed, to a battle. The Orkney-Inga records that the pair agreed to bring 40 mounted men to a place to fight, but that Sigurd chose to break the rules as he thought the Scots were faithless, and so he had his men mount 2 to a horse before riding out to battle. Mael saw the betrayal before the battle was enjoined, but it was too late for him to do more than to go to battle bravely. But Sigurd's actions would come back to bite him. When Maelbricht and his men were killed, the Orkney-Inga relates that Sigurd caused the heads to be fastened to his horses' cuppers as glory for himself. As they rode home, Sigurd spurred his horse, causing his calf to scrape against the famous buck tooth of male bricked. That wound sprung up pain and swelling and led to his death, the Orkney writes. The story has the feel of a morality tale, a particularly biting criticism of Sigurd, and Sigurd's dynasty died quickly when his son died childless shortly after. From what historians can tell, his death led to instability before Ragnvald's youngest son established a lasting dynasty in the Orkneys, which lasted until the 15th century. Sigurd was far from the only ruler to die of an embarrassing accident that seemed to have ironic consequences. Béla of Hungary was forced to flee Hungary for Poland after the death of his probable father, Vasul. In exile in Poland, he married the daughter of the Polish king, while his brother Andrew joined a rebellion in Hungary and seized the throne in 1048. Andrew, however, had no heir, and so he invited Béla to return to Poland and take ownership of a duchy that comprised about a third of the kingdom. Their relationship soured, however, after Andrew had a son in 1053, Solomon, who was publicly confirmed as heir in 1057 or 1058. This led to a civil war between the brothers, with Béla supporting his Polish relations. In 1060, Béla defeated and killed his brother Andrew, but his rule was far from certain, and in 1063 a force of Germans invaded to put Solomon on the throne. Béla, according to the Hungarian Chronicle, was planning on abdicating if he would be allowed to return to being a duke, but his reign was ended ignominiously when, the 14th century Chronicon Pictum explains, his throne broke beneath him. He was badly injured in the fall, half dead, as the Chronicle describes it, and he died shortly after. Some contemporary chronicles suggested that the collapse of the throne may not have been an accident, an early example of the phrase, the chair, being pulled out from under him. This strangely literal version of the death of a sitting monarch left a lesson. Perhaps he shouldn't have sought the throne, after all. Accidents were common in the Middle Ages, and among the many dangerous activities was horseback riding. While not as fast as cars, horses can still reach high speeds, and losing your seat on a horse could cost you your life, whether you were a peasant or a king. In 1129, King Louis VI of France had his eldest and favorite son, Philip, made co-king at the age of only 13. But according to chroniclers, after he was made co-king, Philip became disobedient and strayed from the paths of conduct traveled by his father, and by his overweening pride and tyrannical arrogance, made himself a burden to all. That burden was to last only a short time, however. According to Chronicle Walter Map, in October 1131, at only 15 years old, Philip was riding near the Seine with some companions when a black pig darted out of a dung heap and tripped his horse, throwing him over the horse's head. The fall so dreadfully fractured his limbs that he died on the day following, never having regained consciousness. Map didn't comment on the condition of the pig, but the lesson is clear. When disobeying your father, it's best not to go whole hog. Even when a monarch could make use of what medical knowledge there was, that didn't mean that the physician's advice was very good. In the 14th century, Spain was split into a series of kingdoms, including the small kingdom of Navarre, nestled within the Pyrenees. It was held in personal union with the French kingdom under King Charles IV of France, known as Charles I of Navarre, but the two kingdoms split after his death. He was succeeded in Navarre by his niece, Joanna II, who in 1349 was succeeded by her son, Charles II of Navarre, who had earned the insulting epithet, Charles the Bad. Charles II was actually raised in France, didn't speak the Romance language of Navarre when he became king. Charles was largely interested in pressing his claims to the French throne, and so spent much of his time plotting for his own rise during the 100 Years' War. He openly had the Constable of France murdered in 1354, began plotting with the English to overthrow King John II of France. He repeatedly switched sides between the British and the French in his ongoing machinations, and seems to have been involved in a failed coup in 1355. John II eventually had him imprisoned for his actions, but he was sprung from prison by allies, and in 1357 caused anarchy in Paris when he had all of the prisoners released from prisons in the city. Despite continued effort, he was unable to gain power in France or in Spain. In 1378, the Kingdom of Castile invaded, laying waste to Navarre and forcing Charles into a treaty that made him a perpetual ally to Castile. But if that wasn't enough to humiliate him, he would die horrifically in 1387 at the age of 54. A later English account relates that he was unable to make use of his limbs. The physician ordered him to be wrapped up from head to foot in a linen impregnated with brandy, so that he might be enclosed in it to the very neck, as in a sack. According to the English account, a nurse finished sewing the king into his linen when she decided to use a candle to burn off the excess thread. he immediately burst into flames, as one 19th century historian put it, swathed as it was in matter highly inflammable. And the nurse fled, leaving Charles to burn to death in his own castle, though another version states that the fire started because of a pan of hot coals meant to warm the bed. Well, sometimes a person might fire their physician. In this rare case, it was the physician whose prescription fired the patient. The combination of brandy, Charles the Bad, and fire might be called the good, the bad, and the ugly. The kingdom would fare much better under his son, Charles III, the noble. Sports, meant to be a source of leisure, could easily cause death in the Middle Ages, even if you weren't playing them. French King Charles VIII inherited the French crown at the age of 13 after the death of his father Louis XI. He was described by contemporaries as likable. He was later called Charles the Affable, and also ungainly. Charles proved an ambitious king and pressed for the growth of France against growing Habsburg influence. In 1491, he brazenly married Anne of Brittany, who had already been married by proxy to Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. He also fought the first of a series of conflicts known as the Italian Wars, which lasted for 150 years after he first pressed his claim to the kingdom of Naples, although ultimately he accomplished little in the war. In 1498, at only 27 years old, Charles left his chateau to watch a game of real tennis, also called the Court of Royal Tennis, the medieval sport called the Sport of Kings, from which the modern game of lawn tennis developed. Real tennis became incredibly popular in the 15th and 16th centuries across Europe, especially among aristocracy and royalty. According to a court chronicler, on Palm Sunday he took Anne to see a game in the castle ditch. They entered into a particularly decaying part of the castle, the nastiest corner, as a chronicler called it, which was crumbling at its entrance. It was in such disuse that its main use was apparently as a urinal. Though not a tall man, the king knocked his head as he entered, the chronicler recorded. He recovered, was able to watch the match, but afterwards fell suddenly into a coma. His physicians didn't want him moved, so the king was laid on a crude bed where he died 9 hours later. Thus, the chronicler wrote, died the great and powerful monarch in a sordid and filthy place. How could he have known that a trip to see a game of tennis would end up as a sewer-side mission? He had no surviving children. His death meant that he was the last monarch of the elder House of Valois, which had ruled France since 1328. Strangely, Charles VIII was not the only medieval king to die on account of the relationship between a toilet and tennis. James I of Scotland, not to be confused with James VI, who ruled as James I in England about 200 years later, was a lover of the game as well. His rule was controversial from the beginning, as both of his brothers died young, and he himself was captured by the English in 1406 at age 11. Only a few weeks later, his father died, making him King of Scotland, but he was held prisoner in England for another 18 years. During that time, he married an Englishwoman, Joan Beaufort, daughter of the Earl of Somerset and granddaughter of John of Gaunt, and served with English King Henry V in France, at times against Scottish troops. When he finally returned to Scotland, was crowned in 1424, he faced significant resistance, and in 1425 made war against some of his nobles. 2 years later, he invited the Highland clans to Inverness, where he had some murdered and others imprisoned. In 1436, Scotland joined with France in war against England as part of the 100 Years' War and attempted to seize the British castle at Roxburgh. The siege was a dismal failure and brought into question his leadership. In October of 1436, he called his general council together to increase taxes to continue the war against England, but the lords resisted, and Sir Robert Graham attempted to arrest the king. Graham was imprisoned instead, but James doesn't seem to have realized the extent of the threat. On February 4th, 1437, a council was again called, and the king and queen remained at the Blackfriars Monastery, where he would be assassinated. The Death of the King of Scots, written by a contemporary of the king, describes James' death in detail. About 3 days before the attack, James played palm, a game similar to handball that eventually evolved into tennis. In the courtyard where they played, the ball tended to fall into a drain on a privy nearby. James ordered that the drain be sealed to prevent his balls being lost, as it wasn't a fair playing place for the king. On the night of February 20th, the conspirators acted. James was in his rooms, apparently getting ready for bed with his wife and several other women, but without most of their servants. The monastery was left open by conspirators, and Robert Graham, with around 30 men, sought out the king. The noise of their approach warned James, and he attempted to find a way out of the room. Bars of the windows proved too strong, and he turned instead to the privy, where he ripped up a board and climbed into the cellar beneath, while the women attempted to delay the assassins. James attempted to follow the drain to its exit, but found himself in a trap of his own making. The end was sealed, the same one that he had ordered closed a few days prior. He remained hidden for a time until he attempted to call for the womenfolk to help him, which led the assassins to his location. After a brief but hopeless melee, James I met his match and was out-volleyed in a grand slam by Sir Robert Graham in a sewer drain. His death caused considerable chaos in Scotland. The Queen was injured in the attack but not killed, and James's 6-year-old son was safely away. The conspiracy collapsed, and the Queen's supporters were eventually able to arrest, capture, and kill the conspirators. Shown to be at fault, his actions out of bounds, justice was served to Graham, who was executed. These aren't by any means the only kings or leaders to have died in ridiculous or embarrassing ways during the Middle Ages. Despite participating in combat, it seems that a king was just as likely to die in some ridiculous accident or as a result of their own actions as they were to fall in battle. And these deaths were not without consequence. They would sometimes lead to wars or succession crises that would profoundly impact the lives of millions of people in history as we know it. And even though their deaths might have been notably ridiculous, that does not seem to have detracted from their historical importance. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.